Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Leader Campus interviews. And today I'm talking with Alan Feirer. And Alan is a man who has leadership training, everything DISC authorized partner, team builder, problem solver, author, speaker, and consultant listed on the the
Who wrote that?
page. Yeah, that LinkedIn page. So you're the man to go to. You're the guy. You're the guy in the know. There's no problem. You cover almost all the spaces.
Yeah, let's be all things to all people, shall we?
Okay. Well, thank you for allowing me to interview you. I appreciate it greatly. So let's start out with the first one. I see by your background that you taught in public schools. So what did you discover about leadership through teaching in public school system?
Well, I was a high school band teacher. So to put that very simply, I was in a position where I had to manage a budget, get anywhere, depending on the year in which I was teaching, anywhere from 30 to 150 hormonally hopped up teenagers who were volunteers to willingly work very hard and perform at a high level, while at the same time balancing and managing relationships with administration, parents, booster groups, the public, and colleagues. Mm-hmm. So there's an awful lot to balance there and a lot to manage there. Something I learned not early on enough, no, but I learned eventually, that enlisting students, some of the more higher potential students, in sharing leadership and doing some of the teaching actually helped make things go an awful lot better. So I drew from typical corporate training books and thought leaders to help influence how I ran my classroom, and it made a big difference. I sort of thought personality could do it all. I'm an upbeat and positive guy, but there are certain other things that need to be tended to. So I employed what I learned, and it seems to go very well. Did I answer the question you were asking?
That's fine. Very well. You just mentioned an offshoot of that, or a follow-up question to that is that you said you read a lot of books. What authors or which authors seem to have a great deal of influence on the way that you approach leadership training?
Yeah, that's an easy one. Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner, The Leadership Challenge, 5 Practices of Exemplary Leadership was huge. Really informed. I'm glad I read that one first because I was so hungry to learn more. I'd been confronted on some shortcomings. That's a separate story. Maybe that could last. And it was the first one that I grabbed, and I'm so glad that I did because I think it's a perfect blend of research and data with on the ground track record stuff. So Leadership Challenge, Kouzes and Posner, 5 Practices of Exemplary Leadership. Greenleaf, Robert Greenleaf, Servant Leadership, although reading about Greenleaf's writing is better than reading Greenleaf himself. It's a little dry. I would say the exact same thing about somebody else very influential on me, or whose work was very influential on me, was Peter Senge, who talks about systems thinking. And again, just like Leadership Challenge, just like Greenleaf, just like Jim Autry, who's very fortunately local to us here in central Iowa, and Senge, they do a great job of connecting structure and systems with what's going on here and here in terms of building relationships and the human element.
Okay, very nice. I think that the Leadership Challenge and the 5 things from Posner and Kouzes, I think that's kind of the Bible for a lot of people in the leadership field. I also you list on your webpage or LinkedIn page the 8 models of leadership, or 8 components of leadership. So what's that?
Well, I'm glad you're asking that question after the previous one, because then it'll be a little easier to answer. It'll make more sense. So as I read, I wish I could find this. I've looked for it. I was sure I saved it. Maybe someday in the next 40 years, this piece of notebook paper where I just cross-hatched, like, at all levels, like without any discrimination of quality or rigor, all these authors: Kouzes, Posner, John Maxwell, Stephen Covey, Jim Hunter. I mean, I just did all this, and then I looked at the summaries. I'd written out summaries of all the books I read and broken them down in outlines, and then just tried to find the commonalities Like if I could break this down into a model that would work for me in a public school setting, what would they be? And I came up with three sort of mindsets, or three foundational, I call this the three-legged stool of leadership: service, vision, and integrity. So we meet the needs of others. We know where we're headed and where we're at now. Those are two different but related and important things. We can't ignore either. And then being internally consistent and credible. That's integrity is more than just doing the right thing. There's a predictability and a credibility along with that. Once those three elements of the three-legged stool are in place, we move on to the next three, which are more about on-the-ground observable skills. Communication, probably the most important, arguably, of what's following. Role modeling, which is different than just having integrity. We have to be visible with what we do. And then constant self-improvement. I use the phrase stretching and growing. Covey says sharpening the saw, but just this constant lifelong learning. And then encompassing it all, a couple of words to describe every one of those previous six elements are positive and passionate. That we have to be positive in our service and in our vision development, et cetera. And we have to be passionate. People have to know that we care and see that we care. And positive doesn't have to mean rah-rah. It has to mean a sense of optimism and drive and a belief that we're going to make things happen.
You mentioned some other people as well, and on your LinkedIn page, Lencioni is one of them as well. How about the team unity? Because it's one of the things you talk about in your again description, a team builder. In looking at a team framework, for those not familiar with Lencioni, might you give some kind of small explanation as that as well?
Sure. So if this is too brief, call me on it and clarify.
Okay.
Lencioni says that there are 5 behaviors of a cohesive team, and they're contingent on one another if we're going to avoid dysfunction. The basis is vulnerability-based trust. Not predictive trust, like if I ask Mel to do this, I know he'll do it, but vulnerable trust, like if I say how I feel about this issue, Mel won't judge me or punish me. Once people are vulnerable and trusting, the next one is conflict. Conflict is important. It's the search for truth. And healthy conflict involves debate and discussion that's very open and honest and candid around issues, and we avoid tension between people if we have healthy conflict. So trust, then conflict. Once everything's out there, once we've had the healthy conflict, then comes commitment. Everybody is unified in their commitment to what was agreed upon, not necessarily because they agree, but because they have felt heard and because people trust each other, and the relationships are long-term. And if people are all committed, comes the fourth behavior, accountability, peer-to-peer accountability. The best kind of accountability doesn't require the leader to be micromanaging or even keeping a close eye on things or providing all feedback. If everybody's committed, they hold each other accountable. And then the fifth one at the top of the, it's like a triangle, is results. And everybody gets results, but sometimes they're departmental or individual or agenda-driven. And in Lencioni's model, if we have trust, conflict, commitment, and accountability, then the results are mission-focused, rather than more universal and global, and the right results rather than the individual.
Yeah, that's very good summation. Very, very nicely done. Thank you. But what happens to group dynamics? Have you had this problem, group dynamics, when you have more than one leader within the group itself?
Oh, boy. I'm trying to think of which answer to give to this.
Maybe I did have a gotcha question or stumper.
How about the safe one? If the leaders, so you're painting a picture of multiple leaders in an organization. If the leaders embody those 5, to use the model we were talking about earlier, which is mine, but it is a consolidation of stuff that's already out there, very influenced by Kouzes and Posner. If they're leading the right way, and if the leaders, there are multiple leaders, if they're embodying the best virtues of an effective team, there's probably not much to worry about. To be really on the ground or in the weeds, it's probably really important to have role clarification in a situation like that. And that's where the healthy conflict comes into play. If 2 leaders are working at cross purposes, or they're being sloppy in task assignments or reporting on things, then people don't know who to report to or who's doing what. Yeah. It's why I've got kind of a bias against the matrixed organization. Yeah. And, I'm a bit of a fuddy-duddy on a traditional org chart. It's because it's when we have like a really clear guideline for things, that's when we can be flexible, innovative, creative, and veer off of things. If we start from being kind of footloose and fancy free and flat and trying not to be too hierarchical, that's when we get into trouble, I think.
How much of an influence then has some of those uh, pieces of information that you put together for this book that you wrote, the Dynamic Field Guide, 51 Ideas Leaders Can Use Today? How much or what type of influence came into those? Is that part of that paper that you still can't find where you took all of the subations?
Yeah, really, it's a combination of that plus stuff that works. I have a bias toward action, not toward acting without thinking, but toward, okay, what can we do now? So the idea behind the book was to create some actionable content. It's 51 ideas. That might sound really long. It's not, because each idea is 1 or 2 pages long, maybe a couple. I get long-winded, and we've got 3 there. But it's organized in 8 sections: service, vision, integrity, communication, modeling, stretching and growing, positivity, and passion. So the readings, and I call them readings, are organized with that curriculum in mind. So lots of influence. Something that I came across in the mid-years between the development and now, and before I wrote the book, was the work of the Arbinger Institute on inward versus outward mindset, because that had a direct correlation, using completely different vocabulary, to a concept I already use called the 4 levels of maturity. And I won't go into detail on that right now, but basically we're all either thinking inward or we're thinking outward. And the real danger is when leaders or anybody believe that they're thinking outward because they're getting their basics done. They think they've delivered, but they're actually not thinking interactively. They're still thinking independently. It gets referred to, I counted it last week, 6 times in the book. So that's something else in addition to what I mentioned earlier that comes into play.
Okay, so what may be the top 3 or 4 or so of these ideas in your field guide that you think are really kind of essential? If you boiled it all down from the 51, what 2, 3, 3, 4, or 5, something like that, are essential maybe to the way that leaders should approach things?
I think it's not my favorite, and it's not the best definition of leadership, and maybe it's more of a leadership agenda. But going back to the bias toward action and keeping things simple so that we keep moving, I'd say this 2-word approach: meet needs. That the idea that leaders meet needs. That's what servant leadership is. We figure out what's needed, and then we act on that knowledge. So I think that's one. And of course, I expand on it in there. But instead of thinking, what am I supposed to do now? Or what should a person in charge do right now? Look at the landscape. Look at the person in front of you. Look at the report in front of you. And ask yourself, what's needed? That's what I'm here to do. Meet needs. That's probably number 1. I think the second is the exploration of maturity in the moment and whether or not we're inward focused or outward focused. And I think that those 2 are the 2 most foundational concepts, because if we don't get that, then almost nothing else applies. Because if we get into the section with communication pointers, and a couple examples, I know you asked for the big ones, but I'll give you some examples that might not be the big ones. But avoid saying should. Never be sarcastic. Choose whether or not you're going to give someone your full attention or not, and communicate that intention rather than being half present. Those are behaviors. Those are things that leaders ought to do. But if I'm doing those things, if I'm avoiding sarcasm and I'm saying, Mel, now's a great time. I've got 15 minutes. Let's talk. I can employ these behaviors which are effective. But if I'm doing it in a way that's self-serving, that will become transparent over time and more destructive. I sometimes joke, maybe a little too lightly, but maybe in an attempt to grab people's attention, that when I lead a session about how to work effectively with people, I might interject, these are some of the same things that the propagandists of the Third Reich did and advised leaders to do. These techniques, behaviors that leaders use to be effective, can be used for evil and not for good. Mm-hmm. So starting with the idea of, I am here to serve, and I have to stay self-aware on that. And acknowledge that other people might not be here to serve, but it's only because they haven't been led that direction yet. Oh. Sort of the foundational thought.
Very interesting. I'd like to look at this 51 ideas leaders can use today. So I'll have to try and get a hold of it. And speaking of that, what about authentic leadership? Does that fit into your, or how would that fit into your aspects of leadership? Because that seems to be the big buzzword right now, is authentic leadership.
Yeah, and if you read Leadership Challenge very carefully from the 80s, if you read Servant Leadership very carefully, or sorry, it's The Servant Leader. No, can't remember the name of Greenleaf's seminal book, it's maybe last time, but if you look at that carefully, all of that is saying, even Drucker, even the most like practical, the pragmatic executive, legendary executive coach and leadership expert Peter Drucker, it all starts with building relationships with people and getting to know people, not like in a, hey, let's go out for a drink after work kind of way, although that can play into it, but in a, hey, when we're at work, we know each other, we understand each other, we're empathetic with each other. That's been around for a very long time. And I don't necessarily want to accuse whoever started saying authentic leadership of coining a new buzzword to create traction. But I think that sometimes that happens. So in a sense, I was a little jaded with like the current buzzword or current, whatever we're talking about. And on the other hand, I applaud anyone who says, hey, pay attention to this. Yeah. It's about building relationships first. If you've missed that in all this, if you skipped the first two parts of Alan's book because they sounded too touchy-feely and went straight to the practical behaviors, you are missing something. Be real. And being authentic does not mean saying everything that is going on between your ears. Nobody needs to hear your completely unfiltered.
Yeah, I think there's a difference a little bit between authentic leadership and just straight out, how can I say, straight out, I'm trying to look for a term, not authenticity, but honesty. Straight out honesty. That, like Jim Carrey in You Can't Tell a Lie.
Yeah.
Liar. Okay, well, I want you to we're coming up to the wrap-up time, so I want you to plug your book. How can anyone on the Leader Campus get a hold of the Dynamic Field Guide, 51 Ideas Leaders Can Use Today?
It's available anywhere books are sold online. So Amazon is an option. CreateSpace itself is an option. 800 CEO Read, Barnes & Noble, BN.com. If you're in the central Iowa area, I think it's important to support small businesses. So Beaverdale Books in Beaverdale, Des Moines, and Plot Twist Bookstore in Ankeny. If you do search for my name, Alan Feirer, Feirer, or the Group Dynamic Field Guide, 51 Ideas Leaders Can Use Today, guess which one is shorter and easier to type. You'll come across two books. Because of my background in public schools, it's been almost 10 years since I was in the classroom, but there is a version for youth. So be careful to not get confused and buy the wrong one, or play it safe and buy both. The holidays are coming up for some of us, so they would make a great gift. Is that enough of a plug, Mel? Is that?
Yeah, I think you did it. I think you did a very good job, Alan. I think you did a fantastic job. Thank you so much for the interview. I've appreciated it so much, your insights, and I'm sure the people at the Leader Campus will have a very nice time watching this interview. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
You're quite welcome. I appreciate the work that you're doing to make sure that leaders of all kinds hear leadership thoughts of all kinds. So thanks for reminding those.
Thank you very much. Alan Feirer, please. Again, Alan with his book called The Dynamic Field Guide, 51 Ideas Leaders Can Use Today. Thanks again for your time. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Take care.